Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the London part of the programme. I'm Jo Coburn. Joining me for the duration of the show, Stephen Pound, Labour MP for Ealing North, and Bob Neal, Conservative MP for Bromley and Chislehurst. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Jo.
Now, this week, Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, John Healey, said the government's fire safety testing system was in chaos. And Housing Minister Dominic Raab was failing to offer fresh advice, let alone fresh action to deal with the problems. This was prompted by the revelation that some cladding safety tests will have to be redone after discrepancies. Bob, how else would you describe it but chaos?
I think there's a challenge that we've got to deal with because there's an awful lot of change in the technology. I was the Fire Services Minister myself in the coalition, and actually we have a very rigorous system for testing, but we have had new materials coming on and new combinations of materials, and certainly we've got to make sure that the system keeps up to date with those changes in technology.
Right, well, Bob calls it a challenge. Obviously, your colleague called it chaos.
I call it lethal, potentially murderous chaos. But, I mean, there's some good news. Danny Cotton, who's the current Fire Brigade Commissioner, has now been appointed to the new post, because, as you probably know, that the fire service is being taken into the Mayor's office. So there will be a Commissioner for Fire Safety.
But what will that mean in real terms?
What it means is overview, oversight. Somebody in a central position will have the authority to actually liaise with all the local authorities, all the people who are doing the planning work, all the people who are doing all the risk assessment, and finally we can keep up with the new technology, and we can also have that central body in London with the authority, the oversight, and above all the bank of knowledge that we need, because we have not just the situation that Bob talks about, we have a problem as in Croydon and some other places where people have bought the leaseholds of their flats in blocks. The buildings, the cladding has failed, and they're now being told they've got to come up with £20,000 to pay for new cladding.
The other thing we need to do is to make sure there's rigorous enforcement of this, because you do the testing, great, you ought to identify it as there. There's also concerns that enforcement isn't done properly, though. If fire doors aren't kept properly closed, things like that. So I agree, you actually need a holistic approach.
But do you accept, as Sajid Javid said, whatever the legal case may be, the moral case is clear that the tab should be picked up by the freeholder. So when it comes to cladding being replaced, once the testing has been done successfully to establish whether there is a threat, should government pick up the tab for any council that needs it?
Well, very often, of course, the freeholder will be a housing association, and actually they're the people who are providing affordable housing. So let's look at the practicalities of that.
Well, that sounds like a no, then.
I think it's not quite as simplistic. It's very easy for the Mayor to come out with a soundbite. But the reality is we've got to make this work out.
Right, but I mean,
let's have a look at it.
Only 3 out of 160 social housing towers, and 160 across the country, admittedly, were identified as unsafe, and only 3 of them have had their cladding replaced. Is that too slow?
I think it's about as fast as you can sensibly go, given the pressures that you've got, because very often you'd have to decamp people. I think there is an awful lot of work that's being done. And the levels of risk will vary because sometimes there are other forms of fire protection built into the buildings as well. So I think the key thing is to get it right. Certainly if there's immediate risk, then you have to get people out.
I think Sajid Javid is right, but look, today in London, this weekend, every tower block that hasn't had the cladding renewed will have fire marshals walking around it. We're paying for people's money to walk around buildings. That is one of the reasons why we need to get this done quickly. Not just, and I think Sajid Javid, I have to say the Secretary of State, is absolutely right on this. It is a moral issue, but at the moment we're wasting money by keeping an eye on something that shouldn't actually be a threat.
Yeah, but how easy is it just to move residents out of it? It's not that straightforward, as we know from Grenfell, trying to find the right accommodation.
Entirely, but you know, Grenfell Tower burned down. I was a housing officer in Camden, and I had 3 tower blocks on Mornington Crescent, and this is back in the 80s when we actually renewed the cladding. We didn't move anybody out. The people had obstructed view from their windows, but you can remove the cladding externally. You can do it, and we should do it. And Camden did it all those years ago. Everyone should be doing that. And to say that we're going to have to decant people is very, very exceptional. You would very seldom have to do that.
What you can do is, as Wandsworth, Tory council in Wandsworth are doing, they're fitting sprinklers to all their tower blocks over 10 stories.
Well, they've got on, which is quite right.
Yeah, and they've gone ahead and done it without waiting. So it's not a party thing at all.
We're going to
talk
about Wandsworth. In fact, now. The starting gun has been fired in the campaign for the local elections in London, due to be held in May. Bhavani Vaddi has been to Wandsworth, the jewel in the crown of Conservative local government, which Labour have high hopes of wresting from Tory control.
This was the tune topping the charts last time Labour won Wandsworth Council. But could the local elections become the Waterloo moment for the Conservatives in the borough?
The London Borough of Wandsworth. Over the years, it's got a reputation as a testing ground for the nation's political inclinations.
It's been a flagship Tory council for nearly 4 decades, portrayed as a model of Conservative efficiency in local government, and it prides itself on having the lowest council tax in the country. Now the Labour Mayor of London has declared it a top target in May. Winning control of Wandsworth would have great symbolic power, and the outcome could depend on the results of just a few wards like this one, Queenstown, where housing will be a key battleground. One of the biggest redevelopments in Europe is taking place at Nine Elms, including at Battersea Power Station, with the newly opened US Embassy nearby.
So we're on the Patmore estate, which is just a stone's throw away from Battersea Power Station.
Ida Dickadam is the only Labour councillor here.
We've got council estates like these, which have been sort of run down and lacked investment for decades, and then all around £1 million flats rising up around them. It's completely unacceptable for Wandsworth Council to claim that it has a progressive policy on housing. It's a pioneer of all the worst possible housing policies that have led to this crisis.
The Conservatives are already campaigning and robustly defend their record on housing.
This council has consistently built homes. We've pledged that we will build 1,000 new homes, 60% of which will be affordable, aimed at people who live in the borough, people who work in the borough. We have 2 estate regeneration programs, one in Battersea, one in Roehampton, a net increase of 3,000 homes, of which 40% will be again targeted at people who live and work in the borough. And our key promise has been that this is a council that charges the least amount of tax that is necessary to run the best quality of services.
Labour campaigners were also door-knocking this week. They have high hopes, partly due to the success of this politician at the general election. The Tooting MP increased her majority in what was a marginal seat. The party gained Battersea and increased its vote share in Putney.
Dining out on a low council tax isn't going to cut it anymore. Local residents here in Tooting, where we are today, have said enough is enough. The Labour group will keep the council tax low but prioritise where they spend it. But it won't be plain sailing for Labour in Wandsworth. At the last local elections, they won 19 seats, gaining 6 from the Conservatives, who won 41. Since then, 2 Tories have left the party, meaning that in May, Labour will need 12 more councillors to get a majority.
And according to the Conservative election analyst Lord Hayward, the Tories will need to work hard to prevent that.
There's demographic change going on across the whole of London. The Tories have been doing badly relatively in London for the last 15 or so years. So it makes all London boroughs under threat. Wandsworth, one of the totemic Tory boroughs, very much under threat this time. The indications are it's going to be a fight of their lives. The Conservatives are working from a strong base, but the Labour Party, if I can use the word, have momentum.
Council elections decide who will run your local services. The ones being held in 3 months in London may have wider political repercussions than that. Losing control of Wandsworth or other Tory-led councils may mean the Prime Minister will face her own battle to hold on to power.
5 or 6 years ago, Bob, it would have been inconceivable that we would be discussing the Tories losing Wandsworth. What's gone wrong?
Well, we haven't done well in London in recent years. Rob Haber's absolutely right. You saw that in the general election. And the fact is London has a young demographic. It tended to vote Remain in the referendum, as you know, did I. And we need to make sure that we've got a message for those people. But the other thing I would point out, though, which is sometimes forgotten, Wandsworth has got a very strong local brand as a value-for-money authority and a well-run authority. And throughout the Blair years, even when Wandsworth was returning all Labour MPs, the people of Wandsworth voted for Conservative councils. So I think there's a history there of sometimes drawing a distinction. So nothing's over till it's fought.
How worried are you?
We're taking it very seriously. We're taking every election seriously. I take my borough seriously. We all want to, every election you fight to win.
But this is looking much more shaky, isn't now, than it has done for years.
Well, I think for the reasons that I've just mentioned and the circumstances. But we've got a strong local message that you heard from Ravi Govinda, and I think that people in Wandsworth will probably draw a distinction between the quality of their services and next door in Lambersey.
You can overestimate the power of the influence of the Brexit referendum and the fact that London is seen as this Remainer stronghold. When it comes to local elections, though, that's not going to have the impact or be decisive in the way that Labour hopes.
No, Joe, I think something far more interesting is happening. Bob's absolutely right to talk about the Black, Asian and minority ethnic community, the increase in that in the Remainers and in the youth vote generally, although the youthquake thing isn't so much as...
No, well, it's been proven that it wasn't actually as dramatic as thought.
If you take Barnet, Westminster and Wandsworth, those are three boroughs which I think will go Labour if we keep working on it. I think that Bromley, Bexley and Hillingdon will possibly stay, though naturally I hope for the best on that day. However, if you actually have a look at some of Wandsworth, the top 10 boroughs when it comes to the lowest council tax anywhere in the country, bizarrely, 7 of them are Labour. They're places like Hull and Manchester and Sandwell. The top 2 are Wandsworth and Westminster. And what people are saying to me in Wandsworth and Westminster is it's the priority of the council isn't right. They shouldn't be concentrating purely on trying to reduce the council tax. It should be about quality of life, about services and about housing.
So you do accept that actually the issue of the EU referendum will not be the priority in terms of the campaign?
Because, we're not voting for that. We've had the vote. But there is a kind of a mood out there where that is seen as the progressive vote and the Conservative vote is small and strong.
And is it going to be enough just to hold on to the tradition of Wandsworth having sort of recordly low levels of council tax?
Well, that's part of the mix, but also Wandsworth is one of the boroughs in London which still has a weekly collection of its refuse, something that people regard as very important. It's actually, as Ravi Govindia was saying, got a very ambitious housing programme. There's the 1,000 there, which is council building houses itself, plus their estates generation. Now, Wandsworth's delivering 3,000 houses through estates generation. Momentum have taken over Haringey and have cancelled an estates regeneration project.
Right.
So which part is actually delivering?
How damaging, though, is the issue of outsourcing? Because obviously we've seen Carillion and the loss of that company and the services, the public services that it provides, and Wandsworth is a big outsourcer of services.
When it's done properly, and I think Wandsworth do it properly, then people don't worry, I think, who delivers the service, provided it's a good one. And that's where I come back to the quality of things like refuse and environmental services in Wandsworth, which are amongst the best in anywhere in London. So they've got a good track record on the ground there.
Right. I mean, there is a strong brand in Wandsworth, and, Labour will struggle, despite the fact that it's buoyed by what has happened in recent years, to actually take a council that is seen as such a stronghold for the Conservative Party.
Well, we took the seat of Battersea, very, very much against the odds in the parliamentary election last year. But equally, I think that the point you make about outsourcing is crucial. If you take a borough like Barnet, which is the easy council, they outsourced absolutely everything. They just left a minute number of staff there. People are tired of that. They realise there's no oversight, there's no accountability, there's no democratic input to that. And I think Wandsworth hasn't gone as far as Barnet, but it's gone too far for most people. I think it sticks in people's throats now. And it's not just Carillion and the possibility of difficulties with Capita, but it's a philosophy of actually delivering local services.
How much will May's elections be seen as a test of Theresa May's leadership?
Inevitably, national issues come into that. But I think, again, we will have a decent message, a good message that we can put out there. The Prime Minister is doing a pretty thankless task at the moment, delivering on what was decided in the referendum. At the same time, we've got to carry on the day-to-day management of the country. So I think I think a lot of people respect her for sticking to her guns around this and actually putting up a tough fight under difficult circumstances.
Is she a hindrance, though, to your performance in the local elections?
No, she's not at all. I think they want somebody who is actually getting on with the job.
I don't see a huge amount of affection for her on the doorstep. I think the worrying thing is that nationally the Tories are doing very well in the polls. They're doing far too well, in my opinion.
So why isn't Labour managing to actually outstrip the Tories in the polls?
In London, it is. It is. And I think.
But that's been the case for quite a long time. You're not actually improving on that, and you're only recording votes in preaching to the converted.
Was the best year ever for Labour in London. We didn't win Wandsworth, didn't win Westminster, we didn't win Barnet. No, we are doing better in London. I think possibly for the reasons that Bob enunciates, and possibly for the reasons you do. But the Theresa May factor is the interesting one, because I don't think that she appears to be dragging the party down nationally. In London, I don't see that huge amount of affection for her. But I think Labour must not assume that this is low-hanging fruit that's going to fall into our laps. And we need to work extremely hard to win those boroughs. And anyone in the Labour Party who thinks that the tide is, Jim Callaghan's thing about the sea change is happening, they are wrong. Every one of those seats in London is there to be fought for and won. Nobody has got a free pass this time.
Right. Bob, if you were in charge of the Conservative machine in London, what would you be doing?
I've been wanting to make sure we ramp up our activity, both on the doorstep. We've still got to do a lot more to do on social media. Now, James Cleverly, London politician, is now in charge of that as deputy chairman of our party. We certainly need to be doubling down on our very significant commitment to housing, where we are putting in record numbers of investment into housing, but we always need to run faster on that. And we've also got to make sure that we are seen to be delivering on a pragmatic Brexit, one that works for businesses and jobs in London, particularly because of the big financial services sector that there is in London.
So coming out of the single market and the customs union, how will that go down?
Well, I think that we need to make very carefully sure that we don't do that in any way which prejudices the position of London as the preeminent financial centre, because there's a massive number of jobs.
Immediate 4% hit on the city's GDP.
Well, Labour has been no clearer, of course, on its Brexit policy either.
Well, I think we want to actually get the best possible deal, and if that includes at the moment staying within the customs union, I personally would sign up for it tomorrow.
Now, we've all heard complaints about foreigners buying up London property, driving up prices and leaving homes empty, sometimes in so-called ghost towers, luxury developments that remain uninhabited. Now the Mayor, Sadiq Khan, has proposed to give Londoners first dibs on new properties. But will it increase the number of homes available for local people? Here's Tanjil Rashid.
The Mayor says he's persuaded a group of developers to offer new homes to Londoners first before selling them to buyers abroad. Research that he commissioned found that at least 1 in 10 new-build homes in London were being sold abroad.
What people really didn't like, I think, was homes being sold overseas before Londoners, people living in London, were even aware of those homes being built or being offered for sale.
The measure would apply to new builds under £350,000, of which there were 6,000 sold last year. These properties will be available to Brits for the first 3 months, with Londoners getting the exclusive right to buy in the first month.
It's really not much different from what his predecessor had. This is a voluntary agreement. He hasn't used the full weight of the planning system. It's not going to deliver much in the way of homes for Londoners, especially since he hasn't built many.
I just very much doubt whether this is going to be effective. The actual problem we have is people buying homes that they don't intend to live in. That should be the focus of policy, and that can be done through planning conditions.
The measure won't apply to the luxury apartment blocks some activists have dubbed ghost towers for being uninhabited. There are 26,000 luxury flats priced at more than £1 million currently being developed in London.
And I'm joined by Lisa Mackenzie, an academic at the London School of Economics, who is a supporter of the radical campaigning group Class War. Welcome to the programme. Just before I come to you, Stephen Pound, how would this policy work of giving Londoners the first chance to get to these properties?
Well, it depends on what the mechanism for sale is. If you're simply advertising them through an estate agent, then somebody in Shanghai or wherever could obviously buy it through an agent, for example. You know, there are ways of doing it. It's a two-pronged approach. Firstly, actually increasing the council tax on empty properties, not decreasing the council tax on empty properties. At the moment, you know, after 6 months, for 6 months you get a reduction. Any property that's empty should be doubled up. And it's the actual, when the properties are built, the planning permission is dependent upon the final disposition of the properties. You've got to have real social housing.
Right, but this is voluntary, this scheme, so it's toothless, isn't it?
At the moment, no, it's pointing in the right direction, and we start off with voluntary, and then hopefully, if it doesn't work, then we'll have to introduce statute.
Does it have your support?
It sounds nice on the surface, but I don't think it actually is practically deliverable. And the reason is this: he's not building the houses in the first place. He had £3 billion given by the government to the mayor as a housing pot to deliver 90,000 houses by 2025. He's built 9,000.
Right.
So, you know,
Is Sadiq Khan's policy actually disguising what really needs to be done, as Bob says, which is building a volume of new homes?
Yes, and Sadiq Khan's policy is just empty rhetoric, really. It means nothing. You know, we're going to allow British billionaires to get the first dibs on the 50 million towers in the Shard.
Why would it be British billionaires?
Well, just what he's going to do is he's going to say that the British have going to have the first dibs on properties in London. But the problem is not at the top. The problem is at the bottom. So the housing problem is really at the bottom, and it's about people who cannot get somewhere to rent, or, well, actually not even to buy, but to rent at a reasonable and at a real affordable
Well, what
price.
is a reasonable and affordable price? Because the policy, as I understand it, is for properties under £350,000. Now, that is still an awful lot of money, but it wouldn't just be billionaires who could afford to buy those.
No, it wouldn't. But you know, for working class people in London that have got, you know, a combined income of, you know, perhaps £30,000, they are nowhere near ever going to get on that property ladder in London.
So what would you do?
For me, it's all about real social housing, and actually not even social housing. It's about council housing. Council housing are local government owned, which means we all own it. It's almost like it's a cooperative. It's a local cooperative. For me, it's about council housing. I don't know why Sadiq Khan keeps coming up with these sort of empty rhetoric policies.
And it does sound like window dressing, to coin a phrase from Sadiq Khan, when actually the two things that are important, not enough homes are being built and there's not enough social housing.
No, I think if you actually look at the paper that James Murray produced a couple of weeks ago, you know, the Mayor's Housing Advisor, he specifically talks about the right to buy still impacting on this. If you built 10,000 new homes in London tomorrow without repealing the right to buy legislation, within 2 years they'd all be gone. So we have a huge problem with that, which is why, and in some ways Claire Cobra actually was talking some sense in the Haringey development vehicle. We're actually talking about different forms of tenure. My council in Ealing, we are building housing, but we are building them whereby we can actually allocate them through housing associations where the right to buy doesn't apply at the present time. Otherwise, we're building, and we're simply building for the millionaires of tomorrow.
Right. I mean, in terms of who can afford to buy properties in London, what would you call an affordable price for a London home?
Well, what I was interested in, Stephen's point there, is Wandsworth Council, for example, is targeting their affordable housing properties at people on incomes of 23,000, which is well below the London average. Now, that's what we've got to be doing.
Right.
So I'm with Stephen, actually. In fact, we need a mix of tenures here.
What about taking over empty foreign-owned properties to house the homeless, Stephen? Is that a good idea?
How would you know they're foreign-owned?
Right. Is it a good idea?
I think taking over any empty properties is a good idea. I think we've got one of the problems in London that we have is we've got overseas buyers that are actually not present. They don't live in London.
Yeah, although Sadiq Khan's report found almost no evidence homes bought by overseas buyers were left empty, 1% or less.
I think any of us that live in London and are walking around London, we see the empty ghost towers. I'm not sure what report this is or where he's got the figures or what research they've done, but I know that when we walk around London, there are ghost towers. There are towers that are with no lights switched on. I even know people whose jobs it is to go in and turn the lights on and off.
I mean, what is the spectacle of those empty multi-million-pound properties in buildings like the Shard when the rates of homelessness are still incredibly high in London?
It's a starving person pressing their face up against the window of the restaurant. It's cruel.
Which is disgraceful.
Right, but what should be done about it?
Well, I mean, Lena Jager, when she was the MP in Camden, actually used what was called the Acquired Miscellaneous Properties legislation, whereby they used to go and hammer things on the doors and say, this property appears to be abandoned. And, in fact, Camden had a huge amount of those units. Look, what we should be doing, I'm not so much concerned about the ownership, I'm concerned about the occupation of the property. If you've got this, and I have to say Lisa's right, walk through parts of Kensington, walk through parts of Chelsea of a night time, there's no lights on anywhere in there. I think that if a property is kept empty, quite clearly it's an investment. I spoke to
Very briefly, we're literally running out of time.
I spoke to this person the other day, a Chinese guy was buying a flat, and I said, who are you buying it for? He said, I'm buying it for my son when he's at university. I said, how old's your son? He said, he's not been born yet.
On that note, that's all we have time for. Lisa, thank you very much. And my thanks to all of my guests, obviously to you two particularly.